Okay, we're going to talk about planning your work, and as David said, planning your work is important. I have a background as an engineer, which means I plan things as an engineer. Why? Because trial and error just takes too darn long. We were talking up here in the front. As an ornamental turner, you have two options. You can go into the shop, do trial and error, get a pattern, it finally works, and you kind of feel locked into that because it took you a month to develop this pattern, so you're going to make it for a couple of years, and you're not going to tell anybody else how you did it. What I'm going to present to you is some software that's free, it's available, you can download it, you can use it, and I'm going to gear this towards any ornamental turner, not just the few of us that are using computer-aided equipment. Whether you use an MDF Rose engine or a Holtz or one of John Claude's homemade machines, I would encourage you to take a look at planning your work, seeing what it looks like, and then I'm going to go through an example of one of the boxes I have out there. Now, somebody better keep time on me. Stop me at least 5 minutes before so I can go to the last couple slides I want to show. So, excuse me. No matter what kind of lathe work you do, I'd encourage you to take a look at planning your work. Software is free. I'm on my third iteration of the software. It's very easy for Mac users to install. Just download it anywhere on your disk, click on it, and it runs. You get the same version that I use in the shop. As I make changes, I upload a new version. Windows we'll talk about at the end. That's why I want to save some time at the end for talking about Windows users. My website there, the source code is public. It's on GitHub. You may edit the source code to your heart's content if you have software knowledge or you know someone who does. The terms are keep it free. So all of this stuff is free and you can modify it to your liking. Now, at this point, I'm going to switch over to the live view of the software. This is what the software looks like when you first launch it. And any of these windows you can click on and move around. If you don't like where the windows are, you can move them around, reposition it, and next time you launch the software, it'll be where it's at. There are help files. There's no manual per se, but there is help files. Everything I'm talking to you about is in these help files. It's not a manual of how to do. There are a couple of YouTube videos, but scan through those. At least you'll recognize, oh, there's something in there about the outline editor and what those lines mean and so forth. This is just going to be a whirlwind tour, but there are help files in there that you can refer back to. One of the first things you want to get familiar with is this window up here called the Favorites. Up in that corner called Favorites. This is where you browse through all your files on your disk. You don't have to go outside of the software to do that. So if I can go look through my documents and find out where my shop patterns are, and in particular things on the eggs, and I can then right-click on that and say, make that a favorite of mine. And then the next time you launch the software, it will be one of these things. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different favorites, and this demo one is there. So you can make anything a favorite. Easier to find instead of having to browse through everything every time. And the first thing you'll want to do is be able to create a new folder. So you click on the folder, right-click, right-click, new, from the template file. And the template file is just, I'm just going to call this junk for now. And it's got just a simple bowl shape. In the black background window, that is the outline of your shape as if you cut the piece in half with a bandsaw. And you're looking at it from the side. A couple of different colored curves. The inside curve is this magenta purplish color. That's the inside of the shape. The outside of the shape is the orangey yellow thing. So you can change the thickness down here to being 0.2 instead of 0.1. Notice your inside and outside thickness has changed. The white curve represents the center of a spinning universal cutting frame. And let's keep questions till the end. So I'm going to try and cover a lot of material. And we'll see how that works later when you put down a spinning head cutter like a UCF cutter. That's the center of the cutter where that's going to go. So we have the side view of a shape, and the little points are the digitized points, and its curve fit in between. So if I clear this curve now, and I just start drawing a shallow bowl, okay, there's the outline of a shallow shape. The dots are digitized, so now I've digitized the inside of a shape. I could also clear that out, and if I want to digitize the outside of shape, down here, and if you can't see the arrow, yell at me, I'll take the laser pointer. We can be digitizing the front inside, or the front outside, or the back inside, or the back outside. So here I will make the outside of a vase. Okay, so, and you can take any of these points and drag them, change the shape to anything that you want, and you're seeing your inside and outside of the curve. Let me change this back to a 0.1 inch shape. If you don't want a point, just click it, drag it off the screen, and it goes away. Double click more. If you want a sharp transition, like a sharp edge, more points is usually required to get a nice sharp edge, because that's just the way curve fitting software works. If you want a sharp shoulder, see how I've got 3 points there that are fairly close together? That's how you can get a sharper bend in the curve, because otherwise it will just try to smooth it out. That's just the nature of curve fitting. You can delete the points and take them off the screen. Now, next thing you want to do is you want to see what that looks like in 3 dimensions. So over here in the top left, there's a tab that says View 3D Window. So there's my shape in 3 dimensions with light sources on it. And both of these windows you can zoom in, zoom out, pan, and then in the 3D window you can zoom and pan back and forth, and you can roll it around just by clicking and rolling it. There's several light sources in there, so you can, if you get lost and you don't know where you're at, there's a reset. Now when you're looking at the 3D window, you can either be looking at the inside. Right now I'm looking at the outside shape, where my cursor is right down there. You can select either viewing the inside or outside. Well, the inside of a vase like that is not particularly interesting. It would be interesting if you're decorating the inside surface there. So if things don't look right, just make sure you're selecting you want to view the inside shape of the shape or the outside of the shape. And you can get rid of that grid if you want, or leave it there. You can save that view. Just take a snapshot and it'll prompt you for where you want to save it at, so you can grab a nice picture of that. So that's what the 3D view window is talking about. The nice thing is you can change the shape and instantly see what's happening. If there's a little bit of a bump there and you say, well, I want to get rid of that bump. Okay, so you can design a nice looking shape, save it. In any of these files, of course, you save the file just by hitting the save button. Very upper left corner, little disc shaped thing. Now I've saved that so I can come back and work with it some more later. Okay, now the next thing we want to do is add a simple cut. I'm going to go back and open a file that I had before, test 1. Here's a vase, and I've put a rosette point on it. Let me take that off and show you how you get that. Off to the side, there's all sorts of kinds of cuts. Index cuts, spirals, rosettes in particular. You want to use a rosette cut, like with the UCF, drag that, drop it on the curve. What these lines represent is the dashed yellow represents this tip of your cutter that's spinning. Now you have to know what the diameter or what the radius of your cutter is. And down here in the lower corner, we have a horizontal cutting frame. I could change that to UCF. Here's the radius of my cutter, which I happen to be having now. Horizontal cutting frame, the diameter of the tip, and so forth. The profile on the tip, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So when I have a radius of 0.512 inch on my particular UCF, then this white line is going to be 0.512 away from the outer curve. So that anywhere that that center of the spinning cutter is, it's going to fall on that line, and that dashed yellow line represents the tip of the cutter. It's just going to be barely touching the shape. That's sort of the reference point where you start. The yellow arc represents the cut at its very deepest point. The green represents the cut at its shallowest point, which in this case is up in the air. On the 3D view, you can see sort of like I used to call this pen chuck until John corrected me. It's paper chuck, is that the right term, John? Okay, it's paper chuck. The black line is superimposed on your shape, very much like a paper chuck in 3D. And then you hit the render button, and you'll see what that cut looks like. And so you say, well, okay, that's kind of interesting, but I didn't intend for it to be cutting in the air. So we can change any aspect of that cut. In particular, I'm going to make it deeper. Now, this data navigator window over here, you can edit any information that you're storing in the software, and this properties windows lets you type in a different number. In particular, if I click on this outline, here's all my points that represent the shape. You can manually edit that. For example, this very bottom point, it's not right at 0, so if you say, oh, I want that to be exactly at 0, come over here and just type 0, fine. Now that shape is all the way down at 0. So you can select anything, and in the properties box here, you can edit just about anything. So the outline, you'll often want to edit. Now the cut point, first thing we want to, there's a lot of information we can change. We can manually change the location. We can have it snap to this white curve or not. We can make it visible or not. But in particular, I want to change the cut depth. I'm going to change that cut depth. Since my Rosette has got a 0.1 inch amplitude, I'm going to change the cut depth to 0.1. And so you see a couple of things happening. First, that yellow curve goes 1/10 of an inch in, and you say, oh, that's going to make a hole into the vase. So we want to make the thickness maybe not 0.1, but rather 0.15. Now we aren't going to go through that. So the yellow curve represents the cut at its deepest. The green curve is just barely touching the surface. And you can see in the 3D rendering here, that's a much more pleasing effect, or at least it's more what I want. As you drag this up or down on your shape, you'll instantly see the end result of that. So if I want this cut to be barely touching the very top of the shape, I just drag it up until I get it right where I want. Now you can just do that by trial and error, and you see that's about what I want. Or you can take a look at that yellow arc intersecting with that little corner there, and that's another way to adjust that. You want another cut, you can either drag another one or just double click, and there's another cut right there. Okay, so you can just start stacking these things up and see what it looks like. Now, let me just go through my notes and make sure I covered everything I want. Okay, Data Navigator, we talked about that. Let's talk about rosettes and the kinds of things that you can change on the rosettes. And let me get rid of some of these cut points. Again, you want to get rid of it, just drag it off the screen and it goes away. Or you can go in this Data Navigator window, right-click, delete. That will do it also. If I click on this little arrow, these little enlarge arrows there on the side, you'll see more information. In particular, you'll see some information about the rosette. So we have a whole lot of properties that we can change on every rosette. Let's talk about rosettes for a minute. And I have never had a Holtz lathe that has had the ABCD designations. So when somebody says I'm using an F or a D or a C, I got to go back and look at the table. That's just me. I apologize. I wasn't brought up with that. I think in terms of polygons, like Jean-Claude was talking about a six-sided hexagonal. So I call that a polygon, a six-sided polygon. The inverse of that looks like a flower. You get that from rubbing on the backside or from cutting on the backside of the center, right? So Sine wave, where you got a simple sine wave superimposed on the circumference of your rosette, combinations of big and small. Heart shape, which I'm told is really an F in your terminology. Simple triangle, lotus pattern, two-door rose. These are common names that I use. If you like the rosette, the Holtz nomenclature, I do have the full A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you can adjust the parameters. These are a bunch of photos I made for John Edwards when he was preparing his volume 6 book. These are all simulated on the software, and you can look at what the cuts look like. So we have all of those as well. So on editing rosettes, the most important thing you're going to want to change over here is amplitude. This is 0.1 inch. Repeat, that's the other thing you want to change, is instead of 8 repeats, let's make this 15 repeats. And you can instantly see the effect on your shape there. You can change from a sine wave pattern to a polygon-sided. Let's take a 6-sided. There's your hexagonal pattern there. So you can change that. You can change the amplitude. You can change the phase. And probably the best way to look at that is by adding another rosette, another cut point. If I want to change the phase, I'll change the phase of the second one by half a pattern, which in engineering parlance is 180 degrees. It's not 180 shaft rotation, it's 180 degrees of the total pattern. Engineers think 180 degrees is an invert of the pattern. If you don't like that notation, you could just change it to a fraction of the pattern in the preferences on the program. So now you can move that up and see the effect of that. Add another one, put it back to a 0 degrees phase shift, and see the resulting look of the pattern. Yep, there you go. Okay, so that's different kinds of rosette shapes. Let's talk a little bit about how we can space and plan the spacing. A few other things here. Got to check my notes. On the rosettes, you can also invert the pattern, which is the same as putting the rubber on the back or cutting on the back side of center. You can mask certain bumps, skip every other bump, skip every third bump, and you can make some non-symmetry. We'll come back to that as we have time a little later, so that you don't have to have symmetrical cuts. They can be unsymmetrical. Now, I'm going to go to a different file here and start talking about how to place the cuts. Let's talk about just the lid of a box. So this is just a 2-inch radius, 4-inch diameter disc, and I've got a number of cut points here. You can see the paper chuck lines on there. This is pumping, so you can see them going up and down instead of in and out. And if I render that, okay, that's kind of what that looks like there. I'm going to hide all the patterns except the first one and then talk about that first. So I'm just selecting a bunch of them, making them invisible, redrawing it. The first thing you want to know is how close where do I put that cut relative to the center? And you'll get a different effect, obviously, as you do that. One of the most important things you've got to know is the radius of your cutter and then how deep it is. You can calculate how wide that cut's going to be. The deeper you go, the wider it's going to be. If I just click on this rosette point, here in the grade area is gray because you can't edit it, 0.441. That cut is 0.441 deep at its deepest. I could also put the cursor from here to there and measure that, and you'll see 0.441. Zoom in a little bit. So measure that from there to there, and you see 0.448, 0.441 roughly. So if I want that cut to just barely touch the center of the work, where do I put it? Well, the cut is 0.44 wide, so you move it 0.22 from the center. So I can just drag this and drag it over to 0.22. And you'll notice in the 3D view, the cut is just barely kissing the center. Let me get a little bit better resolution, and that will become much sharper image. Yeah, why didn't that change? Why doesn't it work? I don't want 1.01, I want 0.01. That's just the resolution of the drawing. The finer the resolution, the longer it takes to render this. So I'm trying to keep it a very fast rendering. Okay, so there you can see the cuts are just barely meeting in the center. So you can do it based on, you know, the cut is 0.44 wide divided by 2, 0.21 away from the center, or you can just trial and error until you see that, or you can drag it until that yellow arc, see how that yellow arc just touches in the middle? That's another way to judge where it needs to be. Now when I start adding a second cut, and I make it, let me unhide this second cut. So the question is now, how far away are we going to put that second cut? Well, if it's too far apart, you get that flat area, which might be what you want. Maybe that's what you want. Or you can drag it until that flat spot just disappears. So you can do the trial and error approach, or you can see that the yellow part of this second cut barely touches the lowest point right there. That's another way of doing it. Or you can say, well, it's got to be 0.44 because that's got to be the width of the next one. So you can go on all the way, and let me just made a bunch of changes. Let me just go back and get the entire thing. So there's my entire pattern. Get a little better resolution again. And that's with pumping with, what pattern is that? That's a lotus kind of a pattern, which came from one of the John McGill's rosettes. That's a very nice, attractive pattern. Kind of looks like a nice flower. So if you're on a traditional mechanical machine, you get your cutter centered in the middle, then you go 1, 2.2, make your first cut. 1, 2.2, so every cut is 0.22, 0.22, 0.22. Back it off. You can either zero your dial and do it again, or no, it's 0.22, 0.44, 0.66. You're dialing it, and now you're getting your cuts uniformly spaced, and you're going to get very crisp, clean cuts at the tops because you're just barely cutting no more than you need to cut to get rid of that plateau, that flat surface. Okay, so that gives you some optimum spacing. Let's move on and talk about something else. Instead of rosettes, let's talk about indexing. So here's a cylinder, and just reset to the view on that. And to get index cuts, there's my lines. There's little lines where the cutter is going to go. To get an index cut, you take not the rosette point, but the index point over there. Drag it onto your line, and oopsie. Now my cutter, I'm still using UCF, and now I'm using a rounded end cutter instead of a very sharp pointy cutter. And you have a whole host of built-in selections, and you can make your own. You can get it 60 degree, 90, 120, 150, flat, round, concave, and we'll see what those look like. Now when you render that, you're going to see that, as expected, a nice scooped effect. You can get rid of those lines. We can change the number of repeats on that. Instead of 15 repeats, let's go to 20 repeats. And you say, well, I want to keep increasing that number until they just barely touch. You can just do that by trial and error, or you can do the calculated approach. Okay, well, that looks pretty nice like that. If you want to have the width and spacing about the same, it would be about half of that. Change from a round point to a flat point. And so there, you see the effect of any cutter. And you can make your own profiles. We'll talk about that a little later also. As you drag and drop your index point, move that up until it just barely touches the top. And I do that by taking the deepest part of the cut, and it's just at the very top of my cylinder. Now add another one. Oops, not that one. I want to add another index point onto that, and just barely get those points to touching. And again, how wide is that cut? It tells you the width of that cut for the depth is whatever that says at the angle, 0.607. So that's the width of that cut. So you can either know that you got to move your cutter half of that amount, no, the full amount, or you can just move your cut until the blue lines just barely touch, and then you know your cuts are just barely touching. So several ways of doing anything. Now let's go back to using multiple cutters. Oops, render that. Okay, so what I've got here is several index points. The first one is using a UCF cutter right there that's got a flat tip, 0.512 radius on the cutter, and I'm making the first cuts. Then I'm coming in with a drill frame and making 2 additional cuts. The drill frame has a 90-degree point and a tip width of, the diameter of the tip is 0.125, making a cut there and making a second cut where I've changed the phase to half a pattern offset. So you can see the effect of moving this, changing it, and deciding how close you want that to be to the first one, how close you want it to be to the second one to achieve whatever effect you're after. Okay? Now, let's go to a vertical cutting frame or a UCF that's rotated to be in the vertical mode. That gives the basket weave, if you like that term. I call it a bricklayering effect. So what I've got here is I'm indexing, doing a cut, well, starting at the bottom, taking a cut, taking another cut. So the question is, how deep do I make the cut so that I get just a very nice sharp tip there? Well, you can play with that. You can use a spreadsheet. I've got some spreadsheets on my website. You can calculate that, or you can do it by trial and error, so you get just a nice, sharp, crisp, clean edge on there. You can also change the tip to be a concave cutter and get the bamboo kind of a look. Oops, outside, render that. And so there's a kind of a classic bamboo cut. If you wanted to add the little knuckle on the joints, then you could come in with the drill frame with a little purling tool and make your joints and see what that looks like and get that the way you like. Eccentric cutter frames. Where is that? Indexing with eccentric cutter frame. Now, get rid of that grid. So here's the flat top of a box. I've got an eccentric cutting frame. The radius is 0.3 inches, and you've got a 120-degree point on that. And notice that isn't the way you'd really want things to meet. This is what it would look like. And, well, maybe that is what you want to look like. That's actually kind of attractive, too. And you can get rid of that flat spot in the middle by moving this closer in. See what I did there is I just moved it until that blue edge touched the center, and now my flat top in the middle went away. But notice I got a flat top there again. So then you can just change your radius by trial and error, or by watching the paper chuck plot. Let's change this to a radius of 0.25, and no, we want a bigger one probably. Radius of 0.4. Okay, and now we can move that in until those lines just touch and render that. And then you can play with the depth until you get the true barleycorn kind of a look on there. So again, this gives you some trial and error, or you can do the calculations however you want. The key thing is you can see what it looks like before you go to the shop and cut it. next page. Okay, this is a good time to go off into a design example. Some of you may have seen this little box that I have out there. That was imitating a design. The top right photo was a photo I saw off of a website. I think it was the Skinner auction site. And I was almost tempted to buy that box. It's a nice little ivory box. But then I thought, well, there's some things that I don't like about it. I didn't really like the stone. I did not like the fact that the number of repeats on the pattern here and here and here weren't the same. They weren't even a related number. And that bothers my eye personally. I like it if you got a multiple of 5 or a multiple of 6 or 10 or whatever it happens to be. I like having all the features having a common multiple or a common submultiple. I also didn't like the fact that these lines on the barleycorns didn't quite meet. So you kind of have that funny thing where the lines aren't coincident. And I was thinking, well, I could do better than that. I debated on whether I liked the scalloped edge or not. In the end, I did not go with the scalloped edge, but I let the cutter hang off, and that gave a very interesting effect. So I started with this, and I'll take you through the process of how I use the software to design that. The first thing you need to do is get the outline. So here's the outline of the box, and basically, well, half the box, the top half, the bottom half. You get it until you get a nice, pleasing shape. And I said, okay, now I know how much I have to plane turn this to this outer dimension. Well, I've got 2-inch diameter faux ivory stock. Actually, it's about 2.1-inch diameter. So that dictated my maximum diameter here. How far do I want to hand turn that in to get a pleasing shape where you can measure the difference between those two. So now I've got the shape the way I want it. So let's work now on the first set of cuts on the top. And for this, I'm going to go to a spreadsheet. I should have had this called up before. I apologize for not having that queued up in advance. With the barleycorns, whether you're on a top or the edge of a cylinder, there's 2 different formulas for figuring that out. And these spreadsheets, I uploaded those about a year ago with the math behind them. So I'm going to start out with the center of the cutter, right there, the center of the ECF being at 0.82 inches. And I want it to just barely fall off the edge to get the effect I'm looking for. And I want to have, okay, so I'm entering anything in the green I enter as 0.82 inches from the center. My cutter is a 90-degree point. In this case, I want 24 circles around there, and I want 2 barleycorns included in the circle. Now this drawing is not accurate, but that means how many barleycorns are within one circle. And as you can see, let me hide the other cuts temporarily so you can see just that first cut. Okay, so within one circle I got 1, 2 barleycorns within. And it will tell me that I want the cutter radius on the ECF to be 0.212 inches. So you take your dial caliper and set that ECF for 0.212 inches, and then you will find that the lines just coincide as you would want them to, and you can render that and see what that looks like. Now these aren't true barleycorns because I'm putting additional cuts in there. If you go back to the drawing, it's hard to see. You've got a full diameter circle, a 3/4 diameter, half diameter, and 1/4 diameter circle, each of them offset. And so your second cut here is going to be, I'm going to stick with the lines for a minute, it's probably easier. So I've offset the cutter so that the inner edge is coincident and the diameter is 3/4 the first one. And then I add this next cut. And again, the inner cut is coincident, and now it's half the diameter, so it goes right through the center. And then the very last cut is 1/4 the radius. Now, when I made the, and each of these, the ECF, the first cutter had a radius of 0.212, the next one 3/4 of that, half of that, and a quarter of that. When I did it exactly the way it was supposed to be done, I noticed something interesting happening that I didn't like, and I'm going to zoom in here so you can see that effect. If I go to that cut, it should have been 0.053, and what happened there is, can you see that those lines are coincident on the inside, but right there, I did not like that effect. So by trial and error, I realized, okay, change that radius to 0.043. Now I'm getting those lines right there to be coincident. Now when I render that, it has a much more pleasing look. And the more cuts you get, the longer it takes to render. And so there's that outer ring, and I kind of like that effect where it was not the scalloped edges, but the cuts hanging off the edge. Next thing I wanted to do is the inner cuts. So we'll add those inner lines. And there the ECF actually spans, it's cutting both front and back. So the center of the ECF is right there. I wanted, and these two little blue V's represent the cut from that cut. I wanted right there, that point to intersect so that I did not have a flat spot between the inner feature and the outer feature. And I wanted the plateau in the middle to be big enough to set that little black opal. So that pretty much set the dimensions there, and then it was a matter of getting the repeat, and you can render that and see what that is going to look like. But I'm still using the same, was it 24 or 12? I forgot what I went with on that one. I went to 12 repeats on that, so I could get a little bit finer, well, a little bit more pronounced detail. It was too fine a detail. I wanted a little bit more pronounced to be consistent with what I did there. Then the next thing we do is just take a simple end mill to mill out that area. Not going to take the time, just 2 rings of end mill cutter to bore out that area where I'm going to set the black opal. And the last thing we need to do is get the edge of the box. On the edge of the box, I'm using a drilling frame, and as soon as it quits rendering, okay, so I'm using a drill frame there with a 120-degree point rotating single flute cutter that John Spencer made. I like his cutters a lot. He's not a paid advertisement. I really like the cutters that he's made. And so now we've got that effect. And the whole end result you saw in the other photo, and you can compare that. Okay, there's the entire simulation. It just takes quite a while to render. So I'm not going to take the time now compared to the real photo. And you can see the real thing outside. Okay, and all that barleycorn spreadsheets, that's all already loaded on the website. How are we doing on time? Okay, we got time for just a couple more things. One of the windows that you can pull up on the software is a rosette viewer. If you want to see what a rosette looks like and play with it, you can just call it up, adjust the amplitude. I'm exaggerating the amplitude so I can see it. So if you want to see what a heart-shaped F4 rosette is, okay, there's an F4 rosette for you. You can adjust the amplitude, see what it looks like. Or any of the Holtz, if you don't remember, as I do not remember what a Holtz L is, well, there it is. So you can just look at rosettes and play with them, change the phase, change some of these other parameters. Some of the Holtz rosettes have got patterns within patterns. So you've got the ability to change the other small bump superimposed on the big bumps on a Holtz J pattern, for example. More importantly, you can design your own pattern. So I've got a pattern editor. Now the pattern editor takes one, you define one repeat of the pattern. In this case, there's a sine wave pattern. You define one repeat, and it repeats that as many times as needed and wraps it around the circumference of your rosette. So that's what the sine pattern looks like. You want to make a new pattern. You can do it with curved arc segments, straight line segments, curve fit to dots. I'm just going to do a simple junk 1 pattern and start putting in some points. This is going to look ugly. So that's the pattern I want to repeat. What does that look like in a rosette viewer? Let's go down here and grab that pattern. Well, that's pretty ugly, but you can at least see what it's going to look like. Or you can say, well, I want to, let's clear that. Let's make something that's maybe a little bit more useful. And if you get one side done and you want to mirror the left side to the right side, now we've got something like that. We can put a nice point in the middle, and we can drag that point and mirror that again. Now we can take a look at what that's going to look like. Well, that might have some future, especially at the big amplitudes in the center of a shape. That might have some interest. You get a pattern that you like, you can write it out to a file. You click on this Write Rosette Data, and it will give you a table of degrees versus radius. So if you want the maximum radius to be 3.5, which is what the MDF Rose engines use, and you want the data every half degree or whatever, it just gives you a tab delimited. You can read it into Excel. You can take it to somebody who can massage the data to cut the rosette for you. The point is you can design a pattern. When you get one that you like, you can save it. You can also define custom cutter profiles. Let's go to the profile editor. So here's a 90-degree point. The point is pointing down in this case, or a round point. Now, if you want a stepped junk 2, we'll call that one. Let's say we want a stepped profile where we have several different radii, kind of a staircased effect. Oops, get that point off, drag it off. Kind of crude, mirror left to the right. Okay, you can see down in the bottom kind of a little indication. So you might want to use a stepped, yeah, Josh uses a lot of these kinds of things in some of the patterns you've done. This is just crude. You'd want to get in there, refine it a little bit more. You can use that, put it in a drilling frame pattern, what it looks like. What else can you do? Spiral lines, like straight line effect. Here's get rid of some windows here. Here's an outline of a pen that I happen to have in my pocket, or you can look at it later. Looks like that. And it's got multiple cuts in this peacock pattern. Each one, instead of having a rosette to define it, it has a pattern bar to define it. This pattern bar is a half sine, lump-de-lump-de-lump. It's got an amplitude of 0.094, and that was calculated to just barely meet with so many repeats around the pen. A period, a height of 0.5 inches, and so you could render that. I'm not going to take the time now, but you can work on your patterns. You can do the same thing on guilloche kinds of things. And this doesn't take too long to render. So for working out a guilloche pattern, get the lines off. Okay, so there's a nice lightning bolt zigzag kind of a pattern. Just trying to get the light to hit that right. What else can we do here? Combinations of rosettes. You can, and let's also talk about non-symmetrical. Here's a vase, and it's not symmetrical. Kind kind of lost where I'm at here. So while I'm talking about this, let's start the rendering. This takes a little bit of time. This is the black vase that I have out there. It's a 4-sided rosette, just like you might have with your MDF rose engine. But instead of being 4 sides equal, one side is smaller, 2 sides are in between, one side is longer. And what I'm doing is spiraling that around the vase, from the fattest part of the vase toward the top, and then from the fattest part of the vase toward the bottom, spiraling it, and every 50,000ths of an inch, it's moving over, cutting, moving over, cutter, moving over, cutting it. And so that's the effect. From the top view, you can see the effect of the rosette. It's 4-sided, but it's not symmetrical. And that gives the interesting effect of having one side concave and other sides convex. Take a look at the little vase out there. That's kind of a nice effect. So this is a spiraling effect using 2 spirals. The first one twists up by 30 degrees from center going up to the top, and the bottom one only goes 20 degrees because it's a shorter distance. And we can also add and subtract rosettes. And this is still kind of a work in progress. If you want to have a sign rosette, and let's just make that 30 bumps. So that's what that rosette would look like. And I want to superimpose that onto a 4-sided rosette. So let's take a 4-sided rosette. So here's my first rosette, 30 bumps sign. Here's the second one, 4-sided. And down here, I'm going to say add the 2 together. So that's the kind of effect that you have. It's kind of a bumpy 4-sided thing. You can take up to 3 rosettes, combine them by adding, subtracting, minimum bump size, maximum bump size. And when you're all done, you can either use it to cut something, see what it looks like, or again, write the rosette data out to a spreadsheet tab delimited format. Okay, that's about G-code output. I use the G-code output. Once I have something I like, I hit this little red button up at the top that says write G-code, then I hit the start button on my machine and it makes the piece. It's not quite that easy, but come talk to me later on that. So many of you won't use that aspect of the software, but that is built in for those that have asked for that. Okay, back to the question I get most often is, why don't you put that software on Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8, 32-bit, 64-bit, 16-bit, 8-bit, anything, iPhones, iPads, whatever. And the answer is, I don't have enough time to do all of that, frankly. Microsoft, every week or day, they issue updates, and what often happens is something doesn't work right. With Apple, when I get an update and it doesn't work, I take it in, figure it out, get it working, upload it onto the site, and it's there. I don't have I have a Windows XP machine actually, but I don't even have machines with Windows 7, 8, or 10 on them. So for me to offer a version of the software that is guaranteed to work, I can't do that. It just takes way too much time. The software is uploaded onto the GitHub website. If somebody in the club wants to take the responsibility for compiling it on Windows 10 and making sure it works okay, that would be great if somebody wants to do that. I just don't have the time or materials to do that. And people say, well, I can't afford a Mac computer. Well, the last Mac I bought in the shop, which runs this software just fine, I think I paid $350 for a used Mac Mini, use your standard keyboard and monitor and everything like that. So that's what many of the people that are using the software now just bit the bullet and bought a used Mac Mini on eBay. And the phones and tablets don't have enough CPU power. When you're doing the rendering, it really does take quite a bit of CPU power and a lot of memory. So other than the fact that Apple won't let me provide software unless it's sold through their app store, the tablets and phones just don't have enough horsepower for that. It's the real answer on that. Okay, I'm going to leave a little bit of time for questions. I guess in summary, my opinion and my observation is, through the years, ornamental turners have always tried to use the best technology available. What I'm offering you is using the technology of planning your work, simulating your work. It's okay to use computers. We do it on everything else we do in life. The art is still knowing where to make the cut. This is just a tool to help you figure out where to make your cuts without making a lot of sawdust and going through a lot of expensive wood. Okay, now, questions? Yes?
What is the minimum requirement for your computer, for your Mac?
What is the minimum requirement? I'm running El Capitan, which is the OS, what is it? Yeah, 10.11. I'm using El Capitan 10.11, which is the latest version out now. The next version I will not move to because my desktop computer is an 09 computer, and it's not. But this has worked on, let's see, my shop computer is a 2011 vintage Mac Mini. I bought it 2 years ago for $350. They're probably cheaper than that now. You probably want to have 8 gig of RAM. The operating itself takes 4 gigs. The rendering eats up a lot of memory, so RAM is cheap. That's about it. Yep.
Walking and pumping simultaneously?
I didn't mention that, thank you. I can do rocking, I can do pumping, I can do both simultaneous. I can do both simultaneous with 2 different rosettes, which gives some very interesting results. You can also rock perpendicular to the shape or tangential to the shape. That's something that would be harder for you guys to do with the traditional mechanical machines.
Are you going to work on other cutting frames like ellipse and so on?
I don't have any current plans on that, but dome chucks I do have. Doing the, you can see this little butterfly on the surface. I do that with my dome chuck that also has a tilt feature. The software is in there to do that. The software is in there to take some pattern like a butterfly, a leaf, or whatever, make that pattern on clearly. So it has some of that capability. Elliptical chucks I don't have any current plans for. Yeah?
Bill, two questions. One, you're using everything in inches so that it, or rather than in metric?
Yes.
Because it lines up with the cross slides? You're doing computerized, and that's what I'm
Okay. If you considered any number in here to be centimeters instead of inches, you'd be just fine. Just, you know, what's that grid? Well, the grid is centimeters or inches. The software doesn't care. It's a unit. It's a foot. It might be a kilometer.
I'm referring to exact the units that you're using there. Do they line up with the turns on the cross slides or not?
In the options, I just called down preferences, options. This is where I set my lead screw.
Okay, that's what.
Yep, and somewhere on here is the make it metric button, which I don't see right now, but I know it's in there because I added it because the stage I got out there is metric.
Question 2, since I don't have a computer in the shop, you can print all this and carry the paperwork out, correct?
You put it on a thumb drive, carry it out with you, yeah. Or connected by internet.
Computer in the shop, I was just saying there's a print picture to print your.
Oh, yeah. You can print the entire data structure. Yes, right. Other questions? Okay, thank you for your time. It's a lot of information. I hope you get it and play with it.